I know there is an acceleration in various things. So our accumulation of greenhouse gases is going up and up faster over time. Response in terms of, say, temperature is going up essentially proportionately. And things like sea level rise are also going up faster and faster over time. So things are accelerating. But importantly, the findings from this report are fairly consistent with those that have been arrived at from previous reports. So we're not seeing any major surprises in terms of the science here. It's more an evolution of the science.
And demonstrating what you have been now saying to governments for many, many years. Give us a sense, though, of what extremes we're going to see as a result of this warming.
Well, I think when you pump up the energy in the climate system, you see many different things. So clearly we see heat rising, so the average temperature goes up. Particularly importantly, though, the extreme temperatures tend to go up faster than the averages, so you get a lot more extremes for a little bit of average change. And that's particularly so for our oceans, where we're seeing a very sharp increase in the number of marine heat waves, and they're expected to increase markedly out into the future. But then you've got all the other things that a warming atmosphere does. So it tends to increase the intensity of rainfall. It changes the nature of rainfall, so where it falls and in what seasons gets changed. You get things like sea level rise, both from a warming of the ocean, but also melting of glaciers and melting of ice sheets. You also get things like acidification of the ocean. So as we push out more carbon dioxide, more of that gets taken up by the oceans, and that reduces the pH levels in the oceans. And the list can go on. Like there's a huge, huge number of things that our human activities by producing greenhouse gas emissions tend to impact. Things like fires, things like cyclones.
And we're seeing those fires raging across Europe at the moment, and the intensity has not been seen for many years. The Pacific nations in our region have been begging for years for some form of action and acknowledgement of the impact. The rising waters for them is not good news.
Not at all. And we've already seen a few islands which have been depopulated due to that rising water. So the Carteret Islands to the north of Australia. But clearly the low-lying Pacific nations, there's a whole number of them, are seriously concerned. This is an existential threat. When the sea level rises to an extent, those islands will effectively go under, and those people's homes will disappear and their nations will disappear. And a whole range of things that follows from that. So what happens to their fishing rights? Do they disappear when the islands go under? So really quite profound implications here. And concerningly, what this particular report shows is, yes, the normal scenarios, the scenarios which are to some extent predictable and quantifiable in terms of sea level rise, do really matter when it comes to greenhouse emissions. So a low emission scenario pushes those up by about 0.5 metre. A high emission scenario pushes them up by about 1 metre, which is a real concern. But what this report says explicitly is we can't rule out sea level rises of up to 5 metres by the year 2150. So when we're starting to talk about threats and existential threats, it's not just the low-lying islands which could be affected by this.
That's extraordinary. This report, though, was at pains to point out that there are pathways out. What can we do to stem what lies ahead us if we don't take this seriously?
Well, what this particular report of the IPCC does is it tells us the linkage between our greenhouse gas emission activity and the whole range of climate and sea level and ocean consequences of that. And so it doesn't actually go into the implications of pathways for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't tell us here's how you can go onto a low emissions pathway. What it just does say, if you're on a high emissions pathway, these are the sets of consequences. A low emissions pathway, they're different. But that by itself, I think, is really important. It tells us that we can actually choose which pathway we go on. We know to some extent how to go on those, not necessarily all of the detail, but we know enough to start. But it tells us that we can go into a future which is really quite problematic or one which is much less problematic. The choice is ours.
Well, we've heard Boris Johnson today say that this is absolutely critical. We have to get rid of coal. We have to really commit to cleaner energies. Do you think that political will is shared, though?
Well, clearly, it's very different across different parts of the globe, and the UK is quite unusual in the sense that it has relatively consistent perspectives across the different political divide, across the political divide. So both the Conservatives and the Progressives have similar viewpoints in terms of climate change, and that relates to their history in terms of getting rid of coal mining back in the Thatcher era. And so they are a little bit unusual. But what we actually see is across the globe, almost the vast majority of our trading partners, major trading partners, now have net zero by 2050 or similar policies. Some, like China, are a little bit later, net zero by 2060. Others are earlier. And so what we see is quite a drive towards moving our emissions downwards, and not just at a governmental level, but also at a corporate level. And so we're seeing this being picked up right across the board by the big investors, the big companies, the banks, the insurers, the regulators, all pushing for lower greenhouse gas emissions because they know that there's a risk. And many of them also know that there's a benefit by being quick movers in all of the new markets that are opening up.
Mark, really good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.